The Galactic Council had a name for humanity. Not the official one. The official one was Terran's, clean, neutral, filed in the registry between the Theric of Dust Colony 7 and the Uvesi of the Singing Nebula. But the name the council members used in their private channels, in the lounges after summits, in the low voices saved for things you believed but would never say on record, that name was the loud ones. Humanity had arrived at the galactic stage the way a child crashes a funeral, noisy, confident, completely unaware that they had walked into something that was not for them. Their first transmission to the wider galaxy had been a music file. Not a declaration of peace, not a statement of intent. A music file, something called rock and roll, blasted across 17 star systems at full signal strength, bouncing off relay stations that the Theric had spent 200 years carefully calibrating. The Uvesi, beings of extraordinary acoustic sensitivity whose communication was entirely sonic, had described the experience as something between a slap and a scream. The Keth, old, patient, gray-skinned arbiters who had guided galactic diplomacy for 6,000 years, had called an emergency session. It lasted 4 hours. Humanity never knew it happened. That was the year 2187. By 2190, humanity had sent 3 delegations, 2 research fleets, and 1 strongly worded letter to a species they had confused for a different species entirely. By 2195, they had managed to accidentally provoke a trade dispute with the Han Collective, offer an alliance to a civilization that had been extinct for 3 centuries, and successfully negotiate a mining rights deal in a sector they did not legally have access to through sheer, baffling persistence. The Keth watched all of this. They did not intervene. There was a theory among the elder species, the ones who had been around long enough to see patterns, that young civilizations either burned fast or grew slow. The fast ones collapsed. The slow ones endured. Humanity was doing something that didn't fit either category. They were burning fast and somehow not collapsing. The Keth filed this under anomalous and assigned a junior analyst to keep watching. The junior analyst's name was Verath. She had 4 eyes, 12 fingers, and the patience of something that had personally watched 3 solar systems go dark. She submitted her first report on humanity in the spring of 2198. It read in its entirety, "They are going to be a problem." Her supervisor made her rewrite it with more diplomatic language. The final version said, "The Terran species displays non-standard developmental patterns and warrants continued observation." It meant the same thing. The laughter started small. It started the way most cruelties do, as a joke shared among friends, at first affectionate, then sharper, then something with an edge people stopped examining. The Han Collective started it. They had a gift for that kind of thing. Their ambassador to the council, a pale creature with too many joints and a voice like a blade dragged across glass, had coined the phrase that spread through the diplomatic channels like a slow infection. The soft species. It wasn't wrong, technically. Humans were soft. They had no natural armor, no venom, no echolocation, no second brain, no redundant organs beyond a single spare kidney that even human doctors seemed to find inadequate. They bled easily. They broke easily. They required food every few hours or they became, by their own admission, irritable. They needed a specific temperature range to function. Too hot and they died. Too cold and they died. Too wet and they got sick. Too dry and they got sick. They had a thing called allergies, a condition where their own immune systems attacked harmless particles in the air, and they treated this as a minor inconvenience rather than the evolutionary failure it clearly was. They got tired at night and had to stop working. They had to stop working. Every single one of them, every night for hours. The Han Collective found this so funny they included it in a training module for young diplomats, as an example of how not to build a species. The Uvesi composed a 17-movement acoustic piece about it. The Theric, who communicated through chemical signals, released a pheromone blend that roughly translated to bless their hearts, which in Theric social vocabulary carried the same weight as they don't know any better, and we should not be cruel about it, but also, underneath both of those, we are a little bit glad we are not them. And humanity, busy and loud and spilling across the midrim like something that had knocked over a glass of water and was trying to mop it up with their hands, heard none of it. Or seemed not to. The war came in 2219. Not with humanity. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward in the careful silences of the council chambers. The war was not with humanity. The war was near them, through them, across a corridor of space that the Galactic Council had allocated to the Terran expansion zone, a piece of territorial bureaucracy that had been settled with very little thought, because at the time, humanity had seemed like the kind of neighbor who would not need defending. The Keth-Han conflict, as it was officially recorded, lasted 14 months. The real name, the one used in casualty reports and battlefield communications, was the Throat War, because the contested space formed a narrow passage between two sectors and whoever held it held everything behind it. Humanity held the throat. They didn't start the war. That needed to be said clearly. They had no stake in the ideological dispute between the Keth Arbiters and the Han Collective. They had no territorial ambition in either direction. They had, in fact, submitted 3 formal petitions to the Council asking for the conflict to be moved, since it was disrupting their shipping lanes and causing what their ambassador called, with spectacular understatement, some logistical inconvenience. The petitions were ignored. The Council was busy fighting a war. So humanity did what humanity did. They adapted. Vareth was watching when it happened. Not the moment humanity entered the conflict. They didn't, not officially, not for another 6 months. What she was watching was smaller than that. A single data anomaly in the shipping traffic logs of the Throat. 3 human cargo vessels had gone dark. No distress signal, no explosion signatures, no debris field on any of the long-range scanners, just gone. One day they were there, logged in the transit registry, running standard routes. The next day they weren't, not destroyed, not diverted, not even late. Just gone. She flagged it. It was classified as probable Han interdiction. The Han were known to hit soft civilian targets and filed away. 2 weeks later, 4 more ships vanished. Same pattern, same silence, no debris, no signal. Vareth looked at the pattern for a long time. Then she looked at where the vanished ships had last been registered. All of them at the edge of the Throat, all of them on the human side. She pulled the long-range sensor data for that region, passive scans, gravity readings, thermal bloom from engine wash, and she found nothing. Not the nothing of empty space, which had its own texture if you knew what to look for. The nothing of something that had learned to remove itself from the record. She submitted a second report. It read, "The Terrans are not where we think they are." Her supervisor did not make her rewrite it this time. The Battle of Tessen's Reach was supposed to be a rout. The Han had moved a significant force through the upper channel of the Throat, while the Keth were stretched thin along the southern line. It was clean strategy, predictable, the kind of move that ended wars by making the conclusion obvious before the final engagement happened. The Keth Senior Command had already begun preliminary discussions about terms. The Han fleet came through the upper channel and stopped. Not because they hit a Keth defense line. There was no Keth defense line in the upper channel. The Han's intelligence was good. They had verified the absence of Keth forces 3 times before committing to the maneuver. They stopped because something that wasn't on any scan, wasn't on any registry, and had not been detected at any point during the 4 months they had been monitoring the region stepped out of the dark and sat directly across their path. Not 1 ship. 11. Human ships, But not the cargo haulers and exploration vessels and optimistic little research frigates that the galaxy associated with humanity. These were something else. Long and dark and running cold, with angles that didn't reflect sensor pings the way they should. And weapons arrays that the hand tactical system took 3 full seconds to categorize, because it had never seen them before. 3 seconds is a very long time in combat. The Han Admiral sent an identification request. The response came back in standard galactic common, which humanity had only officially learned 8 years ago, but apparently had gotten very good at. We're the ones whose shipping lanes you disrupted. Then the lead ship, a long, black, silent thing with no visible markings, no running lights, no transponder signal that any Council database recognized, opened fire. Verath watched the battle from the Keth monitoring station at the edge of the Reach. She watched it the way you watched something you had been told was impossible, and were now watching happen anyway, with a strange feeling in the place where certainty used to live. The human ships did not fight the way any Council species fought. They did not form defensive lines. They did not broadcast tactical communications, or if they did, they were on a frequency nobody could crack. They moved as a unit, and then, at a moment she couldn't identify, they stopped moving as a unit and became 11 separate decisions happening simultaneously, which was almost worse to watch because there was no center to attack. The hand tried to target the lead ship. The lead ship moved, not fast, not in the way a combat vessel boosted its engines and pushed for distance. Just, gone, appeared somewhere else, and the weapons it had fired from its original position were still traveling, and they hit something. The Han fleet lost 22% of its capacity in the first 9 minutes. In 11 minutes, the Han Admiral opened a general channel. He did not speak to the Keth. He spoke to the humans. "We request terms," he said. The response took a moment. "Then you should have thought about our shipping lanes." A pause. "We'll send you coordinates. Come with one vessel. Leave your weapons at the edge of the Reach. We'll be watching." And then the 11 dark ships, the ones that had not appeared on any scan, in any registry, that had moved through 14 months of a galactic war without being detected once, went silent. The Han Admiral sat in his command chair for a long time. Then he asked his tactical officer a question. "Where did they come from?" The tactical officer checked her systems, checked them again. "Sir," she said, "I don't know." Verath filed her 3rd report the morning, after the Battle of Tessen's Reach. It was longer than her previous 2, much longer. It contained sensor logs, trajectory analysis, weapons signature databases, and a 12-page section on what she had started calling deliberate signal absence. The active, sustained effort to not be seen that the human fleet had apparently been conducting for somewhere between 8 and 14 months before the battle. They hadn't vanished accidentally. They had practiced. The report's final section was 1 paragraph. The Terran species has been characterized in Council records as a soft civilization, prone to noise, unprepared for sustained conflict, and unlikely to represent a significant military presence in the midrim. This characterization is no longer accurate if it was ever accurate. The Terrans did not build an army. They built a ghost. The Han Collective met it in the dark. The Keth-Han conflict ended 9 minutes later. I recommend the Council update its assessment of the Terran species at the earliest possible opportunity. I also recommend that whoever authored the original assessment consider whether the laughter was wise. Her supervisor read it 3 times. Then he sent it directly to the full Council without changes. For the first time in 41 years of observation work, Verath did not have to rewrite anything. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session 7 days after Tessen's Reach. Every seat was filled. That hadn't happened in 30 years. The last time every seat was filled was the Uvesi water crisis, which had threatened to collapse the biosupport infrastructure of 3 inhabited systems, and had taken 16 months of full council engagement to resolve. Before that, it was the Theric succession dispute, which had nearly become a shooting war. Tesson's reach filled every seat in 6 hours. The Keth sent 2 representatives instead of 1, a thing they had not done since the founding session of the council, when the rules of quorum were still being written. The Han Collective sent their senior ambassador, which was unusual because the senior ambassador almost never traveled, and also their lead military attaché, which was unusual because the Han almost never admitted they had a military attaché. The UVC came in a sealed atmospheric chamber and sat at the back of the room making sounds below the range of the translation system, which everyone in the room knew was not malfunction. They were talking to each other about humanity. The session opened with Verath's report. Not a summary. The full report, read aloud by the Keth Council Secretary, all 47 pages of it, including the 12-page section on deliberate signal absence, and the final paragraph that Verath had been told, quietly and through unofficial channels, had already been forwarded to 6 different intelligence offices before the ink was dry. The room was very quiet while it was read. The kind of quiet that has weight. When the reading was finished, the Han senior ambassador, a tall, pale being with the specific stillness of something that had not moved in a very long time and was now trying to remember how, raised one hand. "I want to be precise about something," he said. "Before the battle, before the engagement, how long had they been in the Reach?" The council secretary looked at her documents. Current analysis suggests a minimum of 4 months, possibly longer. Sensor reconstruction from the passive arrays puts the earliest possible entry date at approximately 11 months prior to engagement. The Han ambassador absorbed this. "So for 11 months, he said, while we were conducting active military operations in the Throat region, while we had 3 dedicated sensor teams running continuous sweeps of that corridor, while we were tracking every vessel that entered or left the sector." "Yes," said the Keth representative. "They were there." "Yes." "And we detected nothing." "Correct." The Han ambassador sat back. He did not speak again for the remainder of the session. What happened next was not an investigation, technically. The Council had no mechanism for investigating a member species that had not committed an offense. Humanity had not broken any laws. They had not violated any treaties. They had, in fact, done something that several council members were quietly struggling to categorize as anything other than beneficial. They had ended a 14-month war in 11 minutes without filing a single piece of pre-authorization paperwork, which was either a violation of about 40 different council protocols or a miracle, depending on how you looked at it. The Keth legal team spent 3 weeks looking at it. Their conclusion, delivered in the careful non-language of entities who had been practicing law for 6,000 years, was that humanity had technically acted in defense of their own territorial zone, technically used force proportional to the threat, and technically not exceeded the rights of a council member species to protect its own shipping infrastructure. Technically, what it was not, technically or otherwise, was expected. So instead of an investigation, the council requested a consultation. A consultation was softer. A consultation implied dialogue. A consultation was the kind of thing you requested when you wanted answers and didn't want to admit that you needed them. The request was sent to the Terran ambassador, a woman named Lyra Vasquez who had been in post for 3 years and who had, in the opinion of most of the council, the specific energy of someone who always knew more than she was saying and had decided long ago that this was the correct way to be. She received the consultation request. She replied within the hour. Her reply said, "We'd be happy to talk. When would be convenient for the council?" The phrasing was so mild that 3 different translation systems flagged it as potentially ironic. The consultation was held in the main chamber. Vasquez came alone. Not alone in the way of someone who had forgotten to bring staff. Alone in the way of someone who had considered the optics, made a decision, and arrived with the precise body language of a person who found the room slightly less impressive than the room wanted to be found. She was not physically large. She was not visually intimidating. She was a small woman in a dark uniform with no insignia, which was itself a kind of statement because every other species in the council chamber wore insignia that could be read like a sentence. Rank, house, affiliation, achievements, a whole biography pinned to the chest. She wore nothing. The Keth senior representative opened the session. "Ambassador Vasquez," he said, "the council thanks you for attending. We have a number of questions regarding the events at Tesson's Reach, and we hope you will be able to provide context." "Of course," said Vasquez. "The primary question," said the Keth representative, "is how? How were 11 Terran military vessels able to operate undetected in a sector under active multi-party sensor surveillance for a period of up to 11 months? Vasquez looked at him. She had a way of looking at things that made you feel like she was waiting for you to finish a sentence you hadn't started yet. "That's not something I'm able to go into detail about," she said. "You understand." The room did not understand, but no one said that. "Can you tell us," the Keth representative tried again, "when this capability was developed? The Council's records on Terran military technology do not include." "We keep some things off the main records," said Vasquez. "You understand." The room understood that she was going to keep saying "you understand," and that each time she said it, it was going to mean something different. The hand military attaché leaned forward. He was not a diplomat. He was a soldier who had been put in a diplomat's chair and was wearing the experience poorly. "How many ships?" he said. Vasquez looked at him. "How many ships do you have?" he said. "That can do what those 11 did at the Reach." She smiled. It was a small smile, not unkind. The smile of someone who appreciated the directness of the question while having absolutely no intention of answering it. "Enough," she said. The consultation ended 2 hours later without answers. Or rather, it ended with a precise and careful set of non-answers, each one delivered with such warmth and apparent cooperation that it took most representatives, until they were back in their own offices, to realize that they had learned nothing. Nothing about the ship's technology. Nothing about the fleet's size. Nothing about when the capability had been developed. Nothing about whether humanity had done this before in other places, in other conflicts, under other names. Nothing. They had gotten nothing. What they had gotten instead was a very pleasant meeting with a small woman in a dark uniform who had drunk 2 cups of something human called coffee, a substance the UVC atmospheric filters had reacted to with alarm, and who had, at the end of the session, thanked the Council for its time, expressed hope for continued cooperation, and walked out of the chamber at the same calm pace she had walked in. Verath, who had attended the session as a junior observer, sat at her desk afterward and stared at her notes. She had written one thing. She was not surprised by any of the questions. That was it, that was the whole note. She looked at it for a long time. Not surprised by any of the questions meant that Vasquez had anticipated all of them before she walked in, which meant she had known what the Council would ask, which meant she had known what the Council knew and what it didn't know, and had calibrated her answers accordingly. Which meant that, however much the Council had been watching humanity, humanity had been watching the Council back. With, apparently, a better intelligence operation. The Han Collective filed a formal information request 3 weeks after the consultation. It was addressed to the Terran government and asked, under Council treaty protocols for mutual transparency in military matters, for a full accounting of Terran military assets in the Mid-Rim. The response came back in 11 days. It was a document. A very thorough document. 18 pages, formatted correctly, filed through the proper channels, stamped with the proper authentication codes, signed by the proper authorities. It listed 6 Terran military vessels in the Mid-Rim sector. 6. The Han attaché stared at it. He counted 11 ships at the Reach. He had the sensor logs. He had his own tactical officer's recordings. 11 ships. The document said 6. He sent a follow-up request. The response was a polite clarification that the 6 vessels listed represented the Terran assets formally registered in the Mid-Rim sector under Council Treaty protocols. Formally registered. He read that phrase 7 times. Then he went to find someone who could tell him what formally registered meant in Terran legal code, and what the distinction was between formally registered and present. It took his legal team a month to find the clause. It was buried in the Terran Military Transparency Annex, which had been submitted to the Council during the initial treaty negotiations in 2201, in a section that had been reviewed by exactly 2 Council analysts at the time, both of whom had found it uninteresting. The clause read, in its entirety, assets operating in stealth-designated configurations during active defensive operations are not subject to standard registry disclosure requirements for the duration of said operations. Stealth-designated configurations. The Han attaché read it again. They had put it in the treaty. In 2201, 18 years ago, when humanity had seemed like the kind of species you assigned a junior analyst to watch, they had put a clause in the Transparency Annex exempting their stealth assets from disclosure. And nobody had noticed. Verath was the one who found the original review notes. She didn't go looking for them. She was doing routine archive work, the kind of low-glamour documentation maintenance that fell to junior analysts between crises, and she pulled the 2201 treaty files to update the index, and there they were. The review notes from the original Council assessment of the Terran Transparency Annex. 2 pages, written by a pair of analysts whose names she recognized as mid-tier bureaucratic fixtures. The first analyst had flagged the stealth clause, had written in the margin, unusual provision request clarification. There was no record of clarification being requested. She looked at the second analyst's notes. The second analyst had written, reviewed, Terrans are not a stealth-capable species, provision likely precautionary or aspirational. No action required. Aspirational. Verath sat with that word for a long time. The galaxy had looked at humanity in 2201, loud, soft, bumbling humanity with their rock and roll transmissions, and their accidental trade disputes and their spare kidney, and decided that a stealth clause in their military treaty was probably just wishful thinking. They had decided that humanity was dreaming. They had not considered that humanity was planning. The Council held a second session. A closed session this time, no official record, no secretary, the kind of session that happened when things needed to be said that could not be written down. The Keth representative opened it. We need to understand, he said, how much of what we know about the Terrans is accurate. Nobody answered right away. Because the answer, which everyone in the room had been arriving at independently over the past 6 weeks, was uncomfortable. What they knew about humanity was what humanity had let them know. What they didn't know was everything else. And the everything else, it was becoming clear, was the part that mattered. The UVC representative made a sound that the translation system rendered as, "We laughed at them. We laughed at them and they said nothing. We laughed at them and they kept building." She made another sound. The translation system struggled with this one. It processed for 4 seconds, which was longer than it usually took, and then rendered it as, "I want to know what else they built while we were laughing." The room was quiet. Outside the sealed chamber, the normal business of the council carried on. Species submitted petitions. Trade agreements moved through committee. A border dispute in the Outer Rim was in its 4th year of deliberation. Inside the chamber, 12 of the most powerful diplomatic minds in the known galaxy sat with the same feeling. The feeling of someone who has just realized that the person they thought was watching the floor had, in fact, been watching them. Verath did not attend the closed session. She was too junior. But someone had left a door open, metaphorically. The room was sealed, and a summary found its way to her desk through channels she did not examine too closely. She read it. She sat back. Then she pulled up the star maps of the midrim and looked at the zones that had been designated Terran expansion over the last 20 years, mapped their shipping routes, mapped their colony positions, mapped the gaps between them, the dark spaces, the unsurveyed corridors, the regions that no council sensor net covered with any reliability. She started marking the gaps. There were a lot of gaps. She thought about 11 ships, sitting in a dark corridor for 11 months, undetected. She thought about how large the unsurveyed corridors were. She thought about how many ships could fit in all that dark. She set down her stylus. She did not file a report. Not yet. Some questions, she had learned, were better held for a while before you made them official. Some things needed time before you knew how afraid you were supposed to be. She turned off her desk light. Outside her window, the station's artificial night had begun. The stars were real, the dark between them was real, and somewhere out there in the dark, something human was moving. She just couldn't see it. Which she was beginning to understand was exactly the point. 6 months after Tessen's reach, a Theric survey vessel found something it wasn't looking for. The Dehen Urat, a mid-sized scientific ship with a crew of 14, and a mandate to catalog mineral deposits in the Outer Rim's 3rd expansion belt, was running passive sweeps of a region that had been designated as uninhabited and uninteresting in the Council's Geographic Survey of 2188. The survey of 2188 had, apparently, missed some things. The Dehen Urat's sensors picked up a gravitational irregularity. Not large, not dramatic, the kind of thing you could easily log as a geological formation and move on. But the ship's science lead, a careful and methodical Theric named Ossian, who had been doing this kind of work for 30 years and had the professional instinct of someone who had learned to distrust easy answers, decided to take a closer look. What the closer look revealed was a structure. Not a natural one. A large structure, tucked into the shadow of a dead moon in a system with no registered inhabitants, running cold, running dark, and reflecting no signals from the Dehen Urat's active sweeps in a way that Ossian immediately recognized as not being about materials. You could build a thing that didn't reflect radar. But it took effort. It took specific effort. She sent a priority signal to the Theric Science Ministry. Then she sat in her command chair and looked at the structure on her passive imaging array, and thought about the fact that this region had been designated uninhabited in 2188, and that it was now 2220, and that 32 years was a long time to be building something in the dark. The Science Ministry forwarded her signal to the Galactic Council. The Council forwarded it to Verath. By this point, Verath had been promoted twice and had a team of 6 analysts working under her. She had also, over the past 6 months, quietly begun building a separate map, unofficial, not filed in any council system, kept on a personal drive she took home every night, of what she was now calling the gaps. The dark spaces, the unsurveyed corridors, the blind spots. When the Dehen Urat's report came in, she checked her personal map. The dead moon was in a gap. Of course it was. She requested a survey mission. Not a military one, a scientific one. She was careful about that. She wrote the request in the language of curiosity rather than concern, because she had learned, in the months since the closed council session, that the word concern had a way of triggering exactly the kind of visible diplomatic response that humanity would notice and adjust for. She wanted to see before she was seen seeing. The survey mission was approved. A small vessel, a neutral crew, one Keth scientist, two UVSI technicians, and a Tharic engineer, with a brief to conduct a standard structural assessment of the anomalous formation in the third expansion belt. They reached the dead moon system in 11 days. They found the structure. They found it, and then they found that the structure was not alone. There were 3 of them. 3 large installations built into the shadow faces of the moon where no passive long-range scan would have found them, connected by what appeared to be underground tunnels bored directly through the moon's interior. The installations were cold, dark, no active power signatures, but the structure itself, the material, the design, the scale, was clearly not natural. Clearly not old. The Keth scientist on the survey team sent back his first assessment with the specific tone of someone who was trying very hard to be objective about something that was making him feel things he hadn't planned to feel. He put the age of construction between 8 and 15 years. He described the scale as significant. He described the design as optimized for concealment. He described the material as not matching any registered Terran civilian construction profiles. He did not describe what he thought the installations were for. He didn't have to. Vareth mapped the dead moon site on her personal chart. Then she spent 2 weeks pulling archive data, shipping lane records, colony registration filings, deep space beacon logs, anything that could be cross-referenced with location data, and she started finding more gaps. Not structures, not yet, but patterns of absence that had the same signature as the throat before Tessen's reach. Regions where signals were slightly too clean. Where survey data was slightly too old to trust. Where the Council's knowledge stopped at the edge of what humanity had formally reported, and the formally reported edge was, in several cases, very far back from where the actual human presence seemed to be. She added 7 new markers to her personal map. She stared at it for a long time. The map looked like a net. Not the kind of net you threw to catch something. The kind you built into the floor before you invited anyone over, and then you waited, and you were very friendly while you waited, and you offered your guests coffee, and you smiled, and you said you understand in that particular way, and you waited. She was not certain this was what she was looking at. But she was not certain it wasn't. The Council formally asked humanity about the dead moon installations. They did it through the standard diplomatic channel, a written inquiry, registered and time-stamped, requesting information on the nature and purpose of the structures found in the third expansion belt survey. The response came back in 4 days. It was a polite letter. It acknowledged the Council's inquiry. It thanked the survey team for their careful work. It noted, with what read as genuine appreciation, that the Council had gone to the effort of conducting a proper scientific assessment rather than simply sending a military observer, which was a gesture of good faith that the Terran government valued deeply. Then it said that the installations were Terran infrastructure, built within Terran territorial designation, for purposes relating to Terran strategic interests, and that under the terms of the Council membership protocols, member species were not required to disclose the nature of internal infrastructure projects. It was signed by Ambassador Vasquez. There was a handwritten note at the bottom. If the Council has further questions, we'd be happy to set up a meeting. We have very good coffee. The hand military attaché, when the letter was shared with him, read the handwritten note 3 times. She's enjoying this, he said. Nobody disagreed. What the council knew at this point was the following. Humanity had a stealth fleet capability that had existed for at least 20 years and had been hidden in plain sight inside a treaty annex. They had used that capability during the Keth-Han conflict to position 11 vessels in a contested corridor for up to 11 months without detection. Those 11 vessels had ended a 14-month war in 11 minutes. The fleet's actual size was unknown. The full extent of humanity's military infrastructure was unknown. There were at minimum 3 significant installations in the outer rim third belt, potentially more. What the council did not know was everything else. How many ships, how fast, how armed, how far out the dark installations went, who else knew, what the chain of command looked like, what the trigger conditions were, what humanity considered a threat worth responding to, and how they responded to it when they decided it was worth responding to. They did not know because humanity had not told them. And humanity had not told them not because of an oversight. The council understood that now. The gap between what humanity had disclosed and what humanity had built was not an accident. It was not carelessness. You didn't hide a fleet for 20 years through carelessness. You didn't put a stealth clause in a treaty annex through carelessness. You didn't build 3 large installations in the shadow of a dead moon through carelessness. You did those things through intention, through patience, through the specific kind of long-game planning that the council had always assumed was a trait of old species. Species who had lived long enough to understand that the galaxy was not always friendly and that the time to prepare for a threat was before the threat arrived. Young species didn't think like that. Young species were loud and impulsive and got into trade disputes with extinct civilizations. Except that humanity had apparently been thinking exactly like that, beneath all the noise, the whole time. The Keth senior representative called Verath into his office. Not her supervisor's office, not a conference room. His personal office, which had a window that looked out at the council station's observation ring, and which she had never been in before and which felt, stepping into it, like a room that remembered every important conversation it had ever held. He did not offer her a seat. He stood at the window and looked out at the stars. "Tell me what you think," he said. Verath considered her words. This was not a moment for careful diplomatic language. He was asking for something else. He was asking for the thing you said when the official version wasn't enough anymore. "I think," she said, "that we have been classifying them wrong from the beginning." "How do we classify them?" "As a young species," she paused, "developing, promising but unpredictable, loud, emotional, prone to making mistakes." "And what are they?" She thought about 11 ships sitting silent in a contested corridor for 11 months. She thought about a treaty annex clause filed in 2201 and ignored. She thought about 3 installations in the dark, and a map full of gaps, and an ambassador who drank coffee and smiled and said, "You understand." "Old," she said. "They think like something very old." The Keth representative was quiet for a moment. "That assessment is going to disturb the council." "Yes," said Verath. "That assessment is going to disturb a lot of people." "Yes." He turned from the window. "File it officially," he said. She did. The report ran to 60 pages this time. It included her personal map, the one she had kept off the council system for 6 months, the one with the gaps marked and the patterns annotated. She attached it as Appendix 1 and noted in the cover letter that it was unofficial, based on inference rather than confirmed survey data, and that she was submitting it because she believed the inference was strong enough to warrant official attention. The section headings were careful and neutral, the way she had learned to write everything that was going to be read by people who might not want to hear what it said. But the executive summary was not careful. The executive summary said, in plain language, what she had been working toward for 7 months. Humanity is not where we think it is. It is not what we think it is. It is not organized the way we think it is organized, or armed the way we think it is armed, or limited the way we think it is limited. The information gap between what Terrans have disclosed and what the available evidence suggests they have built is large enough that our current strategic assessments of the midrim are unreliable. We are making decisions about a galaxy we do not fully see, in a region where another species has significantly better visibility than we do, and that species has given us no indication of hostile intent, but has also given us no indication of its true capacity. I recommend the Council stop laughing and start listening. I also recommend we listen more carefully than we have been, because they appear to have been very quiet for a very long time, and very quiet for a very long time means either they are harmless or they are ready. Given what happened at Tesson's Reach, I no longer believe harmless is the correct conclusion. She submitted it. She went home. She did not sleep well. Not because she was afraid of what humanity would do. She lay in the dark and thought about the dead moon installations, about the gaps, about the net-like pattern on her map, about the fact that none of it looked like aggression. It looked like preparation. There was a difference, and the difference mattered, but it kept slipping away from her in the dark, because the thing about preparation was that it could be for anything. You could prepare for defense. You could prepare for negotiation from a position of strength. You could prepare for a war you hoped never to fight. Or you could prepare to act, and be waiting for the right moment to act, and be very patient about the waiting, the way something very old and very quiet was patient about things. She did not know which it was. She was not sure she wanted to find out. 3 days after she submitted the report, Ambassador Vasquez requested a private meeting. Not with the Council, not with the senior representative. With Verath. Personally. The request was politely worded, went through proper channels, and included a note that said, "I think it's time we had a real conversation. I've read your work and I think you deserve one." Verath read the note twice. Then she sent back a single word. "When?" The response came in 20 minutes. "Tomorrow, bring your map." She stared at her screen for a long time. Vasquez had seen her report. Vasquez had seen the map. The map that Verath had built from inference and pattern analysis and careful reading of things nobody else had thought to look for. And Vasquez's response was not a denial, not a complaint, not a formal diplomatic protest. It was an invitation. "I think you deserve a real conversation." Which meant, Verath understood, sitting in the quiet of her office in the very late night with the stars turning slowly outside her window, that the conversation she was about to have was not going to make her feel better. It was going to make her feel exactly as small as the map suggested she should feel. But she wrote back yes anyway. Because she was an analyst. And she needed to know. The meeting was in a small room on the Council Station's civilian level. Not a conference room, not a diplomatic suite, a place that served food, the kind that wasn't attached to any particular species' cuisine and so served everything badly, which somehow made it feel neutral. 2 tables, 6 chairs, a window that looked out at the docking ring, and the low hum of a ventilation system that the UVC always complained about. Vasquez was already there when Verath arrived. She was drinking coffee. She had a second cup on the table on Verath's side, which meant she had done some research on what Verath could drink and had ordered it in advance. Verath looked at the cup. She looked at Vasquez. She sat down. "Thank you for coming," said Vasquez. "You invited me," said Verath. "I did." Vasquez held her own cup with both hands the way humans apparently did, as if they needed to hold onto something warm. "I thought it was overdue. You could have requested this meeting at any point in the last 7 months." "Yes," said Vasquez, "I could have." She didn't explain why she hadn't. She let the absence of explanation sit between them, which was, Verath was realizing, a thing Vasquez did regularly. Let things sit. Let the shape of an omission carry its own meaning. Verath put her personal drive on the table, the one with the map. Vasquez glanced at it. You brought it. You asked me to. I did. Vasquez set down her cup. I wanted to tell you something about that map, about what you got right and what you got wrong. Then tell me. Vasquez looked at her for a moment. Not unfriendly. The look of someone who was deciding how to begin something that had a lot of possible beginnings. The structure of the map is right, she said. The logic, the way you identified the gaps, the patterns of absence, that's all right. You found the edges of the thing by looking at where our reporting stopped and the inference started. That's good work, real work. But you don't know what you're looking at. And I want to tell you. Because I think you've earned it and because I think you're going to figure it out eventually anyway, and I'd rather you figure it out from us than from a misread sensor log. Verath was quiet. She was not surprised. She was not unsurprised. She was in a place past both of those things, where you had been building toward a moment for long enough that, when it arrived, it felt less like revelation, and more like a door you had been standing in front of finally opening. Tell me, she said. What Vasquez told her started with a date. 2193, she said. 2193 was 4 years after first contact. The year humanity had accidentally provoked the trade dispute with the Han Collective. Do you know what happened internally? On our side during that dispute? Verath thought. The official record on the Terran side of the 2193 dispute was limited. There was a diplomatic resolution. Your trade ministry issued an apology and agreed to a revised shipping agreement. Yes, said Vasquez. That's the part we showed you. The part you didn't see, the part that happened in the 6 weeks before the apology, was that 3 of our trade delegation staff received direct threats from Han Collective private interests. 2 of them were followed. 1 of them was physically confronted. Verath was still. None of this was reported to the council, she said. No, said Vasquez. We handled it quietly. And then we had a conversation at home about the kind of galaxy we had walked into. She paused. We had come in assuming good faith. We had come in loud and messy and honest, the way you come in when you assume the room is safe. And the room was not safe. The 2193 incident was not extraordinary, said Verath carefully. No, said Vasquez. It wasn't, that was the point. She turned the coffee cup slowly in her hands. We looked at the council. We looked at the species that had been here for thousands of years. We looked at how they moved, how they communicated, what they said in public and what they said in private, and we noticed something. What did you notice? That the species who had survived longest, said Vasquez, weren't the ones who had been the friendliest. They were the ones who had made themselves too expensive to attack. The program had a formal name inside the Terran Defense Ministry. Vasquez used it once, in passing, and then set it aside and described the thing itself rather than what it was called. The core of it was simple. Humanity was going to become the most expensive possible target in the galaxy without anyone knowing it was doing so. Not by broadcasting strength. Not by making threats. Not by entering alliances that came with obligations and dependencies, and the kind of visible military presence that made other species nervous and prone to preemptive action. By disappearing. Not literally. They were still here, still loud, still bumbling into trade disputes and sending rock and roll into deep space and filing enthusiastic petitions about their shipping lanes. All of that was real. The mess was real. The rest was a choice. While humanity was being loud about the things it didn't mind being known about, it had gotten very quiet about everything else. The dark installations in the outer rim were not forward bases. They were not staging grounds for expansion. They were exactly what the Council had been unable to categorize them as because the category didn't exist in Council strategic thinking. They were deterrent infrastructure, placed specifically in regions where they would not be found easily, designed to be found eventually, but only by someone paying very close attention, found, and then understood as a fraction of the whole, so that whoever found them would do the math and arrive at the number that was too large to want to test. "You built a ghost army," said Verath, "and then you built it large enough that the ghost would be terrifying." "We built a guarantee," said Vasquez, "specifically, that attacking humanity would cost more than it was worth. Whatever you gained, you'd spend more to get it than it would ever produce." "And Tesson's reach was not supposed to happen," said Vasquez. She said it flat. No apology in it, but no pride either. "We did not want to decloak. We did not want to fight. We wanted the Han fleet to feel observed and withdraw. It took longer than we expected." "It worked," said Verath. "It worked," said Vasquez. "And now you know we exist, and we have to decide together what that means." The together sat in the air between them. Verath turned it over. Together implied a choice being offered. Together implied that Vasquez had come to this meeting not to explain humanity's position but to negotiate something. Not with the Council, with her. "Why me?" said Verath. Vasquez didn't deflect. "Because you're the one who's been looking honestly. Everyone else on the Council has been looking for ways to categorize what we did that make it less alarming. You've been looking for what's actually there." She paused. "We need someone on the Council side who sees clearly. And you need to understand what you're actually seeing, so you stop presenting the Council with a picture that's going to make them make bad decisions." "What bad decisions?" "Panic decisions," said Vasquez. "We've watched the closed sessions." Verath went still. Then she breathed out, "Of course you have." "The instinct," said Vasquez, "when you find something bigger than expected, is to contain it, to counter it, to build something that matches it. We're asking you to help the Council understand why that instinct would be very unfortunate." "Because you'd know." "Because we'd know, yes." The room was quiet. Outside the window, the docking ring turned slowly. A Tharek freighter was coming in to dock. An UVC courier was pushing off the station's edge and drifting toward the transit lane. Normal things. The normal business of a galaxy that had been running, more or less, for millennia. Beneath all of it, somewhere in the gaps, the dark thing sat. Waiting. Not threatening. Not approaching. Just present the way a wall was present, the way something solid and patient was present when you needed to know it was there. "You built this for the Han," said Verath. "For whatever the Han represented. The kind of thing that would follow someone who was alone and undefended and make them understand the cost of being alone and undefended." "The Han were the first ones who showed us the lesson clearly," said Vasquez. "But no, not for the Han specifically. For anyone. For anyone who looked at humanity and thought, soft species, easy target." She said it without heat. She said it the way you stated a calculation. "We are soft. That's real. We break easily and we bleed easily and we need to sleep every night and our immune systems are a disaster. All of that is true. We are not going to outfight the galaxy on those terms." "So you changed the terms." "We changed the terms." Vasquez spent the next hour being specific. Not about numbers, not about locations, not about anything that would put technical intelligence in Verath's hands that could be extracted and used by someone less interested in stability. She was specific about intent, about structure, about the underlying logic of what humanity had built. The stealth fleet existed to be unknown. Its power came entirely from uncertainty. If the fleet's composition became known, if the Council could calculate its size, its range, its limitations, it stopped being a guarantee and became a calculation. And calculations could be worked around. Uncertainties could not. The installations in the dark were the same. They were not fortresses. They were signs. The kind you placed along the perimeter of something you did not want entered, knowing that the sign itself was not the deterrent. The understanding of what was behind it was the deterrent. The Tessans' reach engagement had been a last resort, the most aggressive thing humanity had done in 30 years of building, and it had lasted 11 minutes, and it had ended in terms rather than destruction, which was as controlled an outcome as you got in a shooting engagement. "You could have destroyed the Han fleet," said Verath. "It was not a question." "We chose not to," said Vasquez. "Why?" Vasquez looked at her with the expression of someone who had expected the question. "Because a fleet you destroy stops being a lesson. A fleet that goes home and tells its government what it saw in the dark, that's a lesson that stays." Verath thought about the Han military attaché, about the way he had sat at the consultation session without speaking, about the formal information request and the legal team that had spent a month finding the treaty annex clause. "They are frightened," she said. "Yes," said Vasquez. "That's the point. Frighten the people who would hurt you badly enough, and they spend their energy worrying about you instead of attacking you. And the species who were never going to attack you don't notice the dark mostly. The installations don't interfere with anyone. The ships stay home unless needed. To a Tharek freighter captain running standard routes, none of this is visible." She paused. "It's only visible to the people who are looking for it. And the people who are looking for it are the people who have already decided they might want to test us." She let that sit. "We don't want war," said Vasquez. "We have never wanted war. We want exactly what we came into this galaxy wanting: trade, contact, cooperation, the chance to be part of something larger than one species on one planet. All of that is still true. We just learned fairly early that those things required us to be safe enough to pursue them." The conversation ended the way important conversations ended, not with a resolution, but with a new weight on the table that both parties understood they were going to have to carry. Vasquez left first. She stood, picked up her coffee cup, paused. "Verath," she said. "Yes." "The Council is going to discuss options. Containment options. Ways to match what they think we have or limit our ability to expand. I'm not asking you to stop that process. It's their right. I'm asking you to help them understand that any move in that direction will be watched, and that we will respond to it through the same framework we've been operating in." "Quietly," said Verath. "Quietly," said Vasquez, "and thoroughly." She left. Verath sat in the room for a long time after. The ventilation hummed. The docking ring turned. Somewhere in the dark between all the light of the council station, the stars sat in their ancient positions, indifferent and enormous. She thought about what she had been told. Not everything. She understood she had been told a fraction, the fraction that was meant to be reassuring without being complete. Vasquez was very good at that, giving you enough of the truth that you felt seen and not quite enough that you felt safe, because the not quite enough to feel safe was itself the message. But the core of it was real. Humanity was not an aggressor. Humanity was a prey species that had decided, sometime around 2193, that it was done being prey. And it had spent 27 years making itself too expensive to hunt, and it had done it in the dark, and it had been very patient. And now the lights were on, and the galaxy was looking at the thing it had been laughing at, and the thing it had been laughing at was looking back. She picked up her personal drive. She thought about the map, about the gaps, about all the dark places she had marked where human presence was inferred but unconfirmed. She thought, "I have found perhaps 30% of what exists." She was not sure if that made her feel better or worse. She tucked the drive in her pocket and walked out of the room, past the ventilation hum and the turning docking ring, back toward the council's official spaces. She had a report to write. Not the kind that alarmed, not the kind that escalated, the kind that explained as carefully and as clearly as she could manage the difference between a predator and a deterrent. The difference between a species building toward aggression and a species that had looked at the galaxy, found it unkind, and quietly made certain it would never be unkind to them in particular again. The difference was important. She needed the Council to understand it. Because Vasquez was right about one thing. Any move toward containment, any attempt to counter or limit or test what humanity had built would be watched. And the thing that was watching had 11 months of practice sitting in the dark and seeing everything. She passed the Council's public information desk on her way back to her office. There was a Terran trade bulletin on the board. New shipping rates for the mid-rim cargo lanes, stamped with the Terran Commerce Ministry's official seal. A routine thing. The kind of administrative document that circulated through the Council's information systems dozens of times a week. She stopped and looked at it. The shipping lanes it referenced passed through 6 sectors. She checked them against her map. 3 of them passed through gaps. She stared at that for a moment. Then she walked on. She did not update the map tonight. She would tomorrow. There was always more to find if you knew how to look, and she was getting better at looking. Which meant she understood that humanity was letting her get better, letting her find the edges, letting her do the math. Because the math, when you did it, led to a number that was too large to want to test. That was the point. That had always been the point. She understood it now. She understood it, and it was one of the most impressive things she had ever encountered, and it made her feel, walking down the corridor of the most powerful political institution in the known galaxy, about 3 inches tall. Which was, she suspected, also the point. The Verk Dominion arrived at the edge of the midrim in the spring of 2221. Nobody had seen them coming. Not because they were stealthy, they were the opposite of stealthy. They came in loud and hot and broadcasting, the way a species came in when it had decided that the galaxy was a resource and was tired of waiting to take it. They had 600 years of isolated expansion behind them, a military culture built on the premise that force answered every question, and an intelligence picture of the Galactic Council that was, as their advance fleet discovered immediately upon arrival, extremely out of date. The Verk knew about the Council. They did not know about Tessen's reach. They did not know about the dead moon installations. They did not know about the gaps. They knew what the Council looked like from the outside, 600 years ago, when a Verk explorer ship had passed the midrim's edge and cataloged the species in residence. They knew about the Keth, the Han, the Tharek, the Uvesi. They knew about a young species called the Terrans that had recently achieved interstellar travel and appeared to represent approximately no threat to anything. Their arrival message was broadcast on the General Council frequency at full power. It said, in a language that the Council translation system took 40 minutes to crack, "The Verk Dominion extends greetings to the species of the midrim. We have come to discuss your integration into our administrative structure. We recommend cooperation." The Council received this message. There was a long silence. Then the Han military attaché, who had spent the past year and a half sitting in a chair he had never wanted and thinking about dark corridors and things that moved in them, said, quietly, to no one in particular, "They don't know." The Council's emergency session was the fastest in its history. 12 minutes from the Verk transmission to full Council, a record. There was no debate about whether the message was hostile. There was no debate about whether integration into administrative structure meant what it sounded like. There was no debate about whether we recommend cooperation was a recommendation. There was one debate, and it ran for 47 minutes, and it was about what to do. The Keth representative's position was, contact the Verk, request formal dialogue, and play for time while the Council's military assets were assessed. The Council's military assets, when assessed, were not impressive. The Council had no standing fleet. Individual species had individual military capacity that ranged from significant, the Han, to minimal, the Uvesi, to deeply obscure, the Tharek, who had not formally disclosed their military structure in 200 years. A coordinated defense was theoretically possible. In theory, the Han attaché, who had been starring at the table for most of the session, said, "Contact the Terrans." The room was quiet. "Their ambassador," he said, "contact Vasquez." The Keth representative looked at him. "You want to ask humanity for help?" "I want," said the Han attaché, with the specific precision of someone choosing each word from a small number of options, "to inform the Terrans that there is a large and hostile fleet at the edge of the midrim, and that the Council would welcome their assessment of the situation." It was, everyone understood, a way of asking without saying the word asking. The Keth representative sent the message. Vasquez's response came back in 19 minutes. It said, "We're aware of the Verk. We've been tracking their approach for approximately 2 years. We recommend the Council continue its dialogue process. We will be monitoring and will advise if circumstances change." The room read this message. "We've been tracking their approach for approximately 2 years." The Keth representative read it twice. Then he read it again. "They knew," he said. "Yes," said Verath, from her seat at the analyst table. She had been asked to attend and had spent the session being very still and very quiet and taking notes that she was not sure she was going to file anywhere. "They knew for 2 years," said the Keth representative. "Yes. And they said nothing." "They said nothing to us," said Verath, "but I think it's worth considering what else they might have been doing for 2 years." The room was quiet. Outside the station, somewhere beyond the Council's sensors and the transit lanes and the docking ring that turned with ordinary indifference, the Gaps sat in the dark. The Council opened dialogue with the Verk. It was not a good dialogue. The Verk had a particular style of conversation that was less dialogue and more announcement. Their lead representative was a broad, dark-scaled being called Veth Commander Harak, who had the bearing of someone who had won a lot of arguments by sitting slightly closer than the other party was comfortable with. He sat across the table from the Keth representative and explained, with great patience and a very small amount of warmth, that the Verk Dominion had a successful record of integrating independent systems, and that the Council species would find the process, on the whole, to be to their benefit if they approached it with the right attitude. The Keth representative asked what integration entailed specifically. Harak explained. The Keth representative sent the summary to the full Council through a closed channel. The summary read, in the Keth's careful formal language, as follows. The Verk model involves formal absorption of governing structures under Verk administrative authority, mandatory resource-sharing agreements that strongly favor Verk interests, and a transition period of between 20 and 40 years, during which local species governance would be supervised and progressively reduced. Historical precedent suggests that integration has been completed successfully in 14 systems. And then, in a note at the bottom that was not written in the Keth's careful formal language at all, they mean us to become subjects. I see no diplomatic path around this. I am open to suggestions. The next 3 days were the most uncomfortable in recent Council history. The Verk fleet held position at the edge of the midrim and waited. They had clearly done this before. The waiting was patient and heavy and deliberate, the kind of waiting that communicated, "We are not in a hurry and you are not going anywhere." The Council sent Vasquez daily updates as a courtesy. She acknowledged each one. Her responses were brief, consistent, and maddening in their calm. "We are monitoring. We will advise if circumstances change." On the evening of the 3rd day, Verath was in her office running sensor cross-reference checks, a habit she had developed in the months since Tesson's reach, the kind of background analysis that she now ran automatically, the way some people checked locks before bed, when a data flag came up. She stared at it. She ran it again. She picked up the direct communication line to the Keth senior representative. "There is movement in the gaps," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "How much movement?" She looked at the data. "A lot," she said. The Verk received a transmission at 300 Council Station time. Not from the Council. The signal origin was deep in the mid-rim interior, well behind the Council's position. Multiple origin points, in fact, 7 that the Verk's detection systems could confirm, and a number it could not confirm because they were coming from regions where the Verk sensors were picking up interference that their chief technical officer could not immediately explain. The transmission was audio only. A single human voice. "This is the Terran Defense Directorate. You are currently in a region of space under the protection of the Galactic Council and its member species. We are aware of your position and the nature of your proposal to the Council. We have been monitoring your approach for 26 months. We would like to offer you some information before you make any further decisions." Veth Commander Harak looked at his communications officer. His communications officer looked back. "Continue," said Harak. "You have a fleet of approximately 400 vessels at the mid-rim edge," the voice continued. "Significant capacity. We understand why you believe it is sufficient. We want to be clear with you. It is not for this particular region. The species of the Council are under our protection. They have been under our protection for some time. You were not aware of this. We understand. We have made deliberate choices about visibility." A pause. "We are being visible now." Then the transmission cut, and Harak's tactical display lit up. Not all at once. That was the thing. That was the thing that stayed with the Verk officers who were present in the years afterward when they tried to describe what the next 4 minutes felt like. Not all at once. The first signal was the largest. A vessel, or what the sensors initially registered as a vessel before the system recalculated and produced a number, it then flagged as anomalous, appeared at the midrim's outer boundary, between the Verk fleet and open space, between the Verk and the direction they had come from. It was very large. The Verk had a designation scale for vessel classes that ran from small patrol craft to Dominion carriers. Their largest category was Class 9. The object on their display did not fit the scale. Their system assigned it a provisional Class 11 and flagged that it had no historical precedent for the designation. Then the other signals. Not a flood, not a swarm, one at a time with gaps between them that felt to the Verk tactical officers like something was choosing the timing deliberately, letting each one land, letting the number accumulate. 20. 40. By the time the count reached 60, the shape of the pattern had become clear to Harak's tactical team. The vessels were not forming a battle line. They were not massing for engagement. They were forming a perimeter around the Verk fleet. Not aggressive, not advancing, simply present, surrounding on all cardinal approaches, covering every vector, and running every single one of them with no transponder, no registry signal, nothing on any identification system the Verk had ever developed. Ghosts. 80. 100. Harak's second-in-command said, very quietly, "Commander, where were they?" Harak looked at his display. He looked at the dead space where the vessels had appeared from, regions his sensors had been showing as empty since their arrival. Empty of structure, empty of energy signatures, empty in every way a region of space could be empty. "They were there," he said, "we just couldn't see them." The voice came back. 112 vessels, it said. "This is not the full picture. We wanted you to be able to see something. We thought it was the honest approach." A pause that felt carefully timed. "The full picture is not something we put on display. You understand." Harak sat very still. He understood. He understood with the specific understanding of a military commander who had just run the numbers in his head and found the answer was not a number he wanted to say out loud. If they could see 112, and this was not the full picture, then the full picture was how large. How many dark regions had the Verk crossed to reach the midrim? How many of those regions had been surveyed? What was the difference between we detected nothing and there was nothing? He had been answering that question with certainty for 600 years. He was no longer certain. We have no interest in conflict, the voice said. We have never had an interest in conflict. The species of this council are our neighbors and our partners, and we intend to keep them safe. That is not a threat. It is a description of how things are. We are inviting you to understand how things are and to make decisions accordingly. Another pause. We'd also suggest you not make any rapid movements. Some of our pilots are newer. We'd hate for anyone to get nervous. Harrick stared at the transmission terminal. It was, he thought, extraordinarily controlled. The 112 ships appearing out of nothing, the perimeter, the calm voice, the casual last line, all of it calibrated, all of it deliberate. He had come to integrate a collection of small species into the Dominion. He had arrived to find that one of those species, the smallest one, the new one, the one the old intelligence files described as soft and unlikely to present military significance, was sitting in the dark all around him. Had been sitting there for some time. Open a response channel, he said. The negotiations took 3 weeks. They were not conducted by the Council. They were conducted between Veth Commander Harrick and Ambassador Vasquez, who arrived at the midrim boundary in a single small ship with no weapons visible, and sat across a table from the commander of a 400-vessel fleet and drank coffee, and did not appear to feel any of the things Harrick would have felt in her position. Harrick tried several approaches. He tried authority, she was pleasant. He tried implication, she was clearer. He tried once direct threat. She looked at him for a moment and then said, without moving and without changing her tone at all, "Commander, there are currently 43 Terran vessels within weapons range of your flagship. Your sensors are not showing them. That's not a malfunction." He did not try that approach again. What they arrived at after 3 weeks was not a treaty exactly. It was more of an understanding. The Verk were not being asked to change their goals or their culture or their relationship with the 14 systems they had already integrated. They were being asked to understand where the boundary was. The boundary was the midrim. Behind the boundary were species under Terran protection. The Verk were welcome to trade, to establish diplomatic relations, to pursue any of the things that civilizations pursued with each other in good faith. They were not welcome to pursue integration. Harrick asked, once, what would happen if the Verk chose to disagree with the boundary. Vasquez said, then we'd find out how much it costs, and I don't think either of us wants that. He left. The Verk fleet turned around and left. All 400 vessels. The Council's sensor nets tracked them until they crossed back over the outer boundary, and then they disappeared into the region they had come from, and the midrim was quiet again. The Council's session after the Verk departure was nothing like the sessions before. No emergency, no urgency, no closed chambers or unofficial summaries passed to junior analysts through back channels. This was a regular session. On the agenda was a routine matter. The Theric had filed a long-pending question about beacon calibration in the outer shipping lanes, and it had been sitting in committee for 8 months. The beacon calibration question was resolved in 20 minutes. Then the Keth senior representative looked around the room. The Council has a matter to formally address, he said. We have an item that has been waiting for some time, and I believe it is appropriate to address it now. He looked at the Terran seat. Vasquez was there. She was always there at the regular sessions, reliable and quiet, and apparently finding the beacon calibration discussion very interesting. "The Council wishes to formally acknowledge," said the Keth representative, "the role of the Terran Defense Directorate and the Terran government in the events of the past year and a half, including Tessen's reach, including the Verk boundary negotiation, including the ongoing protection that the Council has apparently been operating under for a period of time longer than the Council was aware of." He paused. "We also wish to formally acknowledge that the Council's historical assessment of the Terran species was, in several significant respects, incorrect." The room was quiet. "We categorized you as a young civilization," he said, "developing, loud, prone to mistakes." Vasquez did not say anything. "We did not consider," he said, "the possibility that the noise was a choice." Vasquez spoke for about 4 minutes. Not long. She didn't do long speeches. She thanked the Council for the acknowledgement. She said that Terran policy remained oriented toward cooperation and mutual security. She said that the Terran Defense Directorate would continue to operate in the ways it always had, which included some things that would remain unspecified, and that this was not going to change, but that the Council was welcome to think of it as a feature rather than a complication. She said the coffee machine in the consultation room had been upgraded, and everyone was welcome to use it. The hand attaché in the back of the room made a sound that no translation system could categorize. Then she said one more thing. She said it looking at Verath, who was sitting at the analyst table in the corner, which was where she always sat, which was a position that let her see everyone in the room without being the center of anything. "We never wanted to be the most powerful thing in the room," Vasquez said. "We wanted to be the thing that made the room safe enough that power wasn't the measure. That's still what we want. It's what we'll keep working toward." She sat down. Verath wrote that down. All of it. After the session, Verath went back to her office. She sat at her desk and opened her personal drive and looked at the map. It was larger now, much larger. In the year and a half since she had started building it, she had added dozens of markers, gaps, patterns of absence, inferred positions, regions where Council sensor coverage went thin and something else went wide. It was a large map. And it was, she understood now, still only a fraction of the truth. She thought about what Vasquez had said. We never wanted to be the most powerful thing in the room. She thought about the 112 ships appearing out of nothing. She thought about the voice on the Verk transmission, calm and unhurried, saying, "This is not the full picture." She thought about 2193 and the trade dispute, and a species that had looked at the galaxy it had walked into and decided, quietly and with extraordinary patience, to make itself impossible to hurt. She thought about all the laughter, the jokes in the private channels, the training module the hand had made, the 17-movement UVC acoustic piece about humans needing to sleep every night, the theric pheromone that meant bless their hearts. She thought about what had been happening in the dark, while all of that was happening in the light. She thought about the specific texture of the past 27 years. Then she closed the map. She was going to need a bigger file. She was going to need a lot of things. New analytical frameworks, new categories, new ways of thinking about what soft species meant when the soft species had decided to stop being something anyone tested. She was also, she realized, going to need to update about 40 different Council classification documents. The one labeling humanity as a developing civilization, unlikely to represent a significant military presence, was the most urgently wrong. She started with that one. She typed the new classification slowly, made sure every word was right, made sure it said what it needed to say without saying more than was necessary, the way Vasquez said things. The new classification read, Terran species, reclassified, long-term strategic actor, Significant military capacity, undisclosed extent, operates primarily through deterrence framework, historically non-aggressive. Council protection relationship, confirmed active. Threat assessment to council members, none. Threat assessment to hostile actors targeting council members, substantial. She paused at the end. Then she added one more line. Note, do not assume you have the full picture. You don't. She saved it, filed it, leaned back in her chair. Outside her window, the station's artificial night had begun again. The stars were where they always were. The dark between them was the same dark it had always been. It just meant something different now. Out there in the gaps, in the dead spaces between sensor ranges and survey data, in the cold shadow of moons with no registered inhabitants, in corridors that moved without showing themselves on any scan, humanity waited. Patient, present, silent, not because they were hiding, because they had decided, a long time ago in the middle of a trade dispute that nobody else had thought was important, that the galaxy was not always kind, and that the answer to an unkind galaxy was not to be loud about your teeth. It was to let the galaxy wonder if you had any. And then, when something came out of the dark toward the people you had decided were yours to protect, you let it see. Just enough. Just the fraction that made the math too large. The fraction that said, this is not the full picture. And then you watched it turn around and leave. And you went back to being quiet. And you waited. Because the galaxy was old and large and full of things that hadn't come yet. And humanity had all the time in the world.